The morning had started the way most of our mornings did, in silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the silence of two people so at ease with each other that words feel unnecessary. This was the silence of a palace with 47 rooms and only one occupant who felt welcome in any of them. Me. And even that was debatable. I had been Queen of Valdoria for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. I know because I counted. Not out of some romantic attachment to the anniversary, but because every single one of those days had felt like a math problem I couldn't solve. How do you add warmth to a man built entirely out of marble? Aldrich wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. He didn't shout. He didn't belittle. He simply didn't show up. Not emotionally. Not in the ways that matter when you're sharing a life with someone. He was present in body and completely absent everywhere else. I had married him believing that love could be built the way a house is built, brick by brick, with patience and intention. I was 24. I was optimistic. I was, to put it plainly, wrong. The press conference had been scheduled as a routine address to the nation. Something about trade agreements with the northern provinces. I had been asked to attend, and as a show of unity, a symbolic gesture, his communications director had said. Just stand beside him, smile, and let the cameras do the rest. So there I was, standing beside him, smiling. I was actually thinking about whether I'd remembered to water the small herb garden I kept on the east balcony when Aldrich cleared his throat and deviated completely from the prepared script. People of Valdoria, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him both admired and feared since he ascended the throne at 29. I have an announcement of a personal nature. I turned to look at him. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling you get when a plane hits unexpected turbulence. A sudden awareness that the ground is very far away. After careful deliberation, he continued, eyes fixed on the camera, never once glancing at me, and in consultation with the Royal Council, I have made the decision to dissolve my marriage to Queen Serena. Effective immediately, this union is annulled. She will, of course, be treated with the full dignity and respect due to her during this transition. Dignity and respect. The room went absolutely still. I watched one of the junior press officers drop his pen. Somewhere behind the camera line, I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," in a voice so small it barely existed. 30 million people were watching. And Aldrich Voss, King of Valdoria, the man who had slid a ring onto my finger in front of the entire world, had just ended our marriage without ever once looking me in the eye. I have replayed that moment many times since. What I felt wasn't devastation, it wasn't rage. It was something far more clarifying than either of those things. It was the sudden, crystalline understanding that I had spent 2 years trying to reach a man who had never once tried to reach back, and that somewhere along the way I had mistaken his silence for depth when it was really just distance. So I did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. I nodded once, slowly, the way you do when a decision has been made that you weren't consulted about but will nonetheless accept. I looked directly into the camera, not at him, at the camera, and I said, clearly and without a tremor in my voice, "Thank you for informing me." Then I turned and walked off the stage. I didn't run. I didn't stumble. I walked, in my cream silk gown, through the velvet curtains, past the stunned production crew, down the corridor lined with portraits of kings and queens who had weathered worse. And I kept walking until I found a small room off the main hall with a window that looked out over the palace gardens. I stood there for a long moment, watching a gardener below trimming a hedge with slow, methodical care. The world was carrying on. Of course it was. My phone had already begun to vibrate in my clutch. My sister. My press secretary. 3 missed calls from my mother with a voicemail I knew would begin with, "Serena, I told you." I turned the phone face down on the windowsill. I needed exactly 60 seconds to feel everything I was feeling. The ache of 2 years compressed into one sharp moment. The strange grief of losing something that had never quite been whole. And then I needed to decide what came next. The 60 seconds passed. I picked up my phone, called my personal driver, and said 4 words, "Bring the car around." Here is what Aldrich did not anticipate. I left, not in anger, not with a scene. I simply gathered the 3 things in that palace that were genuinely mine. A leather journal, a photograph of my grandmother, and the small potted rosemary plant from the east balcony. And I walked out of the Valdorian royal palace for what I fully intended to be the last time. I had a friend, Mara. She was an architect who lived in the old part of the capital city, in a converted townhouse with creaky floors and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and paint. She was the kind of person who didn't ask too many questions in a crisis. She just opened the door, took one look at me standing on her doorstep in a cream silk gown with a rosemary plant under my arm, and said, "I'll put the kettle on." We sat at her kitchen table and I told her everything. Not dramatically, just straightforwardly. The way you describe something that has already happened and can't be undone. She listened. She refilled my cup. She didn't once say, I knew it, or what are you going to do? Which is exactly why she was the right person to be with in that moment. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the world had caught fire. I didn't know this in real time. I was sitting in Mara's kitchen, eating toast, deliberately not looking at my phone. But later, much later, I would piece together what had happened in those 3 hours from news reports, from people who were there, and from Aldrich himself. The moment I walked off that stage, the broadcast had cut to an emergency standby screen. Within 4 minutes, the clip of my exit was already circulating across every social media platform in existence. Not the announcement, my exit. The way I had walked, the way I had spoken those 4 words. Thank you for informing me, with such quiet composure that half the watching world had burst into tears on my behalf, while the other half started drafting opinion pieces about what kind of man ends a marriage on live television. Public response, by all accounts, was not kind to Aldrich. His communications director resigned within the hour via a very tersely worded email. 3 members of the Royal Council called emergency sessions. The Prime Minister, who had not been informed of the announcement, reportedly used language in his private office that is entirely unsuitable for this story. And Aldrich sat in his private study, behind closed doors, and watched the world turn against him in real time. I am told by his private secretary, who was one of the few people who genuinely liked me during my time at the palace, that he didn't move for 40 minutes. He just sat there, reading the headlines as they rolled in, watching the clip replay on every channel, watching me walk away with my shoulders straight and my head high and a rosemary plant. I think it was the rosemary plant that did it, honestly. There's something about a woman who remembers to take her herb garden when she leaves that communicates a very specific message. I am not coming back. At the 1-hour mark, he asked his secretary where I was. At the 90-minute mark, when no one could tell him, he asked again, this time with a quality to his voice that his secretary would later describe to me as something I had genuinely never heard from him before. At 2 hours, he called my personal driver. My driver, a quietly loyal man named Thomas, who had worked for me specifically, not the palace, for 18 months, told him only that I was safe and did not wish to be disturbed. Aldrich asked if Thomas would at least tell him what I had taken with me when I left. Thomas thought about it for a moment and said, her journal, sir, a photograph, and the rosemary. There was a long pause on the line. Just the rosemary? Yes, sir. Another pause. Thank you, Thomas. At the 2-hour and 45-minute mark, a black car with no royal markings pulled up outside Mara's townhouse. Mara looked out the window, looked back at me and said, Serena, there's a very miserable-looking king standing on my doorstep. I took a long sip of my 3rd cup of tea. Is he wearing the look? I asked. She studied him for a moment. What look? The one where he's figured something out but doesn't know how to say it yet. She looked again. Actually, that's exactly it. I set down my cup, smoothed the front of my, by now very wrinkled, cream silk gown, and I went to the door. He looked terrible. I want to be honest about that. King Aldrich Voss, whose public image was built on composure and control, looked like a man who had spent 3 hours colliding with the consequences of his own choices. His tie was loosened. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there this morning. He was standing on Mara's slightly uneven doorstep with his hands in his pockets and no security detail, which told me more about the state of his mind than anything he could have said. He looked at me for a long moment, then he looked at my gown, still wrinkled. Then, oddly, his eyes moved to the rosemary plant, which I had set on Mara's kitchen windowsill where it would get the afternoon light. You took the rosemary, he said. Not an accusation, just an observation, as though he'd been thinking about it for some time and needed to say it out loud. It's mine, I said. I grew it from a cutting. I know, he exhaled slowly. Serena, Aldrich. He ran a hand over his jaw, a gesture I recognized, one of the few unguarded things he ever did, that small tell that meant he was struggling for words. I had spent 2 years waiting for him to struggle for words, for anything that indicated something was happening beneath the surface. I made a catastrophic mistake, he said. Yes, I agreed. You did. The council, there was pressure. The northern situation, the succession question, and I told myself that making a clean, decisive move before the press forced the conversation would be, Aldrich. He stopped. I don't need the explanation right now, I said. I need something else. He waited. And this right here was the moment I had never thought I would get. 2 years of silence, of conversations that stopped just short of real, of feeling like I was pressing my hands against glass and finding nothing warm on the other side. And now he was standing on an uneven doorstep in a city neighborhood he'd never visited, without his security team or his communications director or the careful script of royal protocol, And he was just a man, uncertain and tired, and looking at me with something in his eyes that he had never quite let me see before. Something that looked a lot like, "Please don't go." "Tell me," I said quietly, "one true thing. Not what the council wants, not what reads well in a statement. One true thing right now from you." He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not be capable of it, that whatever had been sealed up inside him for so long had calcified beyond reach. But then he said, in a voice that was lower and rougher than his public voice, a voice that had no performance in it at all, "I have been afraid of you since the day we met, not of you specifically, of what it feels like to need someone. I've spent my entire life building walls against that feeling because every single time I've allowed myself to need something, it has been taken away. And I genuinely believed that if I ended this before you decided to leave on your own terms, it would hurt less." He paused. It did not hurt less. The street was quiet around us. Somewhere down the block, someone was cooking something that smelled like garlic and olive oil. A cat crossed the road with the total indifference of a creature who has never once worried about a kingdom. I thought about the 2 years, the silences, the distance, the mornings alone in 47 rooms. I thought about the woman who had stood on that stage and nodded once and walked away without crying. And I thought about the fact that she was still standing here, listening, which meant something she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. "Come inside,"
My lady,
I finally
you grace
said.
this humble kitchen.
"Mara will make you tea."
And you, my
He
lord,
blinked.
bring chivalry.
It's not forgiveness," I said clearly. "It's not a decision, it's tea. And then we're going to talk. Properly. Like two people who owe each other the truth." Something in his face shifted, all that careful composure giving way to something quieter and more real. He nodded, once. Then he looked at me with those gray eyes that had always known how to be steady and said almost too quietly to hear, "I'm sorry, Serena, for all of it." "I know," I said, and I stepped back to let him in. We didn't reconcile that evening. That would be too simple, and nothing about us had ever been simple. We sat at Mara's kitchen table, three very mismatched people and one pot of tea, and we talked until the sun went down and the streetlights came on outside the window. He talked about his father, about the year he was 12, and the thing that had been taken from him, about the way a palace can feel exactly like a prison if you've been trained to believe that needing people is the same as being weak. I talked about the herb garden, about how I had started it in the 3rd month of our marriage because I needed one thing in that palace that I had built myself, that grew because I tended it, that was mine in a way that didn't depend on a title or a ring or anyone else's approval. He listened, actually listened, not the polite, waiting for his turn listening of press conferences and formal dinners. He listened the way you do when you're genuinely afraid of missing something. At some point, Mara quietly excused herself and went upstairs. The cat from down the street appeared on the windowsill and regarded us both with tremendous skepticism. "I don't know how to do this," Aldrich said eventually. "Any of it, the being known, the letting someone close enough to actually matter." "I know," I said. "But you came here tonight without a script, without your team, without any idea what I was going to say." He looked at me. "That's the beginning," I said. "That's what it looks like." He reached across Mara's slightly sticky kitchen table. This man who had addressed parliaments, signed treaties, moved through the world with the certainty of someone who has never once had to ask permission, and he put his hand over mine, carefully, like something he wasn't sure he had the right to. "Can we start again?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment, at the loosened tie and the shadows under his eyes and the careful, uncertain hope in his face that he was clearly not used to wearing in front of anyone. "Not from the beginning," I said. "We keep what's true, and we build from there." His hand tightened slightly on mine. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay." Outside the window, the rosemary sat in the fading light, quietly growing. Some things, once they take root, don't give up easily. Neither, as it turned out,